The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 2. Agricultural Thought and Industrial Thought. Chapter 4. Vegetarianism and Capital Punishment. The eating of meat and the execution of criminals are the two acts that bring out more intensely than any others all our perplexities as human animals. It is difficult to come to any decision about them without appearing either a brute or a humbug. At the root of both of these questions it is advisable to place the not necessarily inhuman proposition that life is in itself not important. Our values make it so, but they are mostly, the important ones, non-human values, although the intenser they are the more they imply a supreme, vital connotation. To attach, as the humanitarian does, a mystical value to life itself, for its own sake, is as much a treachery to spiritual truth as it is a gesture of humanity. We execute a criminal for a variety of frivolous reasons, and often kill the wrong one. The manner of the administration of our law is thoughtless and brutal usually. But the theory of capital punishment, if the punishment of the two just God of the law could be abstracted from it, is as humane as possible. A higher value than all he can allege in his favor, namely, the fact that he is alive, we consider is threatened by the most violent and extreme criminal. It is his violence that we are seeking to eliminate by destroying him. It is the principle of non-violence that he menaces by his existence, which is a superhuman one. We know that to improve our conditions as animals we must banish violence from life. We put a value on life, a violence value, as it were. The assassin or poisoner cannot plead that he should live because he is alive, when it is life, and in addition the only thing that gives life a supernatural value, that he is attacking. It is sometimes necessary to kill men, as it is always necessary to kill tigers, Mr. Shaw admits in the preface from which I have already quoted. And many people hold that it is very often necessary to kill men as it is necessary to kill sheep in prodigious numbers. Shaw is saved by his vegetarianism from extending his permission to massacre, but are the tigermen untamable? Or could they not all be trapped and put in a zoo, where the humane crowds could examine them at leisure? One of Mr. Shaw's principal intellectual weaknesses is his optimism where the success of taming is concerned. That is the liberals' old and terrible mistake. The permission to slay the tigerman is belated. And the kindliness shown to the man-eating tigerman has accounted for the slaughter of more sheepmen than any simple brutality could ever have done. The theory is so humane, but in practice it is so inhuman. So the point is reached at last when all the liberal men can say is what we have heard Mr. Bertrand Russell saying. Failing that, the world being saved by kindliness, it seems that the solution which the Houyhnhnms adopted towards the Yahoos, namely extermination, is the only one. Apparently the Yahoos are bent on applying it to each other. This is a rather bloodthirsty point of bitterness for the liberal, surveying the sanguinary chaos for which he is responsible, to have reached. The intricate problem of capital punishment cannot be dealt with, of course, here, in a few passing observations. For my purpose, however, it is enough to say that the rhetoric of death and of the law, devised as a punishment and a deterrent, is one thing, and the question of regarding the loss of life itself, apart from the needless tortures of trial and execution, as inhuman or not, is another. In general, it can be asserted that the characteristic humanitarian attitude reposes on an exaggeration of the importance of crude and concrete life itself. Life, tout court, plays too great a part in that attitude. The cruelty of the law, on the other hand, errs in assuming a sensitiveness that is certainly absent in the majority of violent criminals. That accounts for the deterrent notion. In general, men seem disposed to think that other men are greater cowards than in fact they are. Animal courage is the most underestimated of common facts. It seems that people are not as a whole so attached to life as they are supposed to be, or they are attached differently. About the animal world of Darwin's struggle for existence, with which Mr. Shaw's preface to Back to Methuselah principally deals, men must be even more mistaken. Many of the situations observed by Fabre and other entomologists can only be accounted for in the way that Weismann, to Mr. Shaw's horror, accounts for them. Here is the passage in which he discusses this point. And the Darwinians went far beyond denying consciousness to trees. Weismann insisted that the chick breaks out of its eggshell automatically, that the butterfly, springing into the air to avoid the pounce of the lizard, does not wish to avoid death, knows nothing about death, what has happened being simply that a flight instinct evolved by circumstantial selection reacts promptly to a visual impression produced by the lizard's movement. His proof is that the butterfly immediately settles again on the flower, and repeats the performance every time the lizard springs, thus showing that it learns nothing from experience, and, Weismann concludes, is not conscious of what it does. Battle itself, or murder even, is probably not horrible for living creatures, only thinking about those things. Action, mechanical functional activity without reflection, probably leaves no room for the conception of death. Although it is disputed, it is still a widely held belief that primitive men did not understand or reason about death, as they were ignorant of the circumstances of their coming into the world. We have the well-known statement that the horse in the burning stable is very difficult to get away. He moves into the flames if left alone, he does not wish to leave the fire, which he does not understand and which fascinates him. He is like the child who has never burned his fingers, but likes and is attracted by the pleasant flame. Without accumulating instances or going farther into this, it seems likely that the bird being fascinated by the snake is having what we should call a fascinating experience, perhaps unique in its life. Until it is killed, which naturally terminates its pleasure, it is having the time of its life. The snake, it is true, is an artist, and that Mr. Shaw would hardly understand. But many insects develop mesmeric headdresses and symbolize their destructive purposes with emblems of terror and power that probably make the insect world, for their victims, a place of delight. To take two of the homeliest examples, it is probable that the mouse enjoys its half-hour with the cat when it is caught very much. Then who can doubt that the spinster or susceptible widow with a small bank account enjoys every minute of the time during which she is being destroyed by some homicidal impostor for her money? And the soldier, except when he is inactive and has to think and imagine instead of act, is no doubt usually having a most enjoyable time. He likes acting better than thinking, habit is strong, and he will find ways of acting even when thrown on his own resources, and in a situation more favorable for thought. To conclude, the vast mistake, exemplified so well by Mr. Shaw, is that he does not realize that men are tigers, wasps, and wolves, or parrots, geese, sheep, and asses, or the humdrum monkey, rather than men. He is, in short, too anthropomorphic. For all his lifetime of raillery and scolding he has not realized quite what sort of animal he has been talking to. The creatures that we see around us are not men, there is some perversion, the cause of which we cannot penetrate, Rousseau would have told him. I think that his is a creditable and amiable mistake, but it puts him, and those of his persuasion, in a weak position where the science of life is concerned. Sometimes, of course, he will pretend to understand, as when he is describing the embarrassments of the ruler. Good-natured, unambitious men are cowards when they have no religion. They are dominated and exploited not only by greedy and often half-witted and half-alive weaklings who will do anything for cigars, champagne, motor cars, and the more childish and selfish uses of money, but by able and sound administrators who can do nothing else with them than dominate and exploit them. Government and exploitation become synonymous under such circumstances, and the world is finally ruled by the childish, the brigands, and the blackguards. That statement is full of confusions, because he has only half come out of his shell into the light of reality. For example, he admits that even able and sound administrators can find nothing better to do with unambitious men than dominate them. Exploit is only an emotional redundancy, for whoever heard of a ruler not getting something out of his rule? But then he winds up with his children and blackguards, immediately forgetting his admission of the able and sound administrators into the picture. Yet, if such people exist, and he says they do, these able and sound personages would surely have something to say to their childish and blackguardly rivals, and not necessarily leave them to have the last word and the world to be finally ruled by them? What Mr. Shaw does not add, but should, is that unambitious men would far rather be ruled by a brigand or a child, whom they can understand, than by Mr. Shaw. For that would require a measure of ambition that is unfortunately by no means common. That is the fallacy of the philosopher king that we are brushing against. Mr. Shaw has been a sort of mocking and mischievous conscience to middle-class England for a good many years. People have put up with him because, in his capacity of a conscience, he was such a respectable thing to have. He has been the one thing that has saved their face while all the time he has been persuaded that he was putting them dreadfully out of countenance. But he has often been angrily accused of treating the public with contempt. The mistake emphasized above shows him, of course, in an opposite light, the mistake in virtue of which, bursting with optimism and friendliness, he approached the public brimming innocently with highly intellectual conversation, as though cheerily exclaiming, "Ah, you old villain, I'll make a philosopher of you before I'm done with you." The public has smiled, and remained a villain. Horatio wrote in his tablets in vain where Mr. Shaw is concerned. In the nursery in which the blackguardly children, who will do anything for cigars, champagne, and motor cars, rule the unambitious children, whose appetites do not aspire to these exciting luxuries, and in which Mr. Shaw has sat like a very genial uncle, a kindly twinkle in his eye, humorously recommending the unambitious to revolt, there is a great deal of bloodshed. The game of government goes on, and it is a game that no philosopher has ever been able to interrupt seriously for a moment. The children die in shoals, the philosopher is aghast. But they hardly know they are dying, in the way, at least, that the philosopher understands it. The villains of the play, namely, the children fond of champagne and cigars, are as intent on the game, and as childlike, necessarily, as the others. The presence of a grown-up, a philosopher like Mr. Shaw, is useful. It enables them to be more ferocious than ever. The freedom of speech in which he is able to indulge is their sanction. It gives an air of fairness to anything that happens. Mr. Shaw especially, would give an air of fairness to almost anything. His mere presence at the most disgraceful spectacle would confer a certain respectability on it. The philosopher stands wringing his hands, and the bloodshed redoubles in violence. A paroxysm of slaughter supervenes. When it abates, the voice of the philosopher is heard imploring the children not to cut off the tail of a mouse they have caught. Ever since Darwin set up circumstantial selection as the creator and ruler of the universe, the scientific world has been the very citadel of stupidity and cruelty. Fearful as the tribal god of the Hebrews was, nobody ever shuddered as they passed even his meanest and narrowest little Bethel or his proudest war-consecrating cathedral as we shudder now when we pass a physiological laboratory. In the listlessness and exhaustion ensuing on what was perhaps the biggest beano that has ever occurred, the voice is heard exclaiming, "Neither the rulers nor the ruled understand high politics. They do not even know that there is such a branch of knowledge as political science, but between them they can coerce and enslave with the deadliest efficiency, even to the wiping out of civilization, because their education as slayers has been honestly and thoroughly carried out. Essentially the rulers are all defectives, and there is nothing worse than government by defectives who wield irresistible powers of physical coercion." The scandal of these childish sports is, however, probably about to receive the attention of a more efficient principle of order than that of the irresponsible philosopher. Instead of the ineffective sporting fairness of moral authority, there will be the justice of force. Let us suppose that turns out worse than things have always been. At least the attempt is on novel lines, the old factors of failure are as far as possible eliminated. And at least the power engaged has shown from the start a sympathetic understanding of the adage, "Boys will be boys," which commutatively could be expressed, "Animals will be animals." Which is more than can be said for the author whose views I have been discussing, who wishes that all the children would grow up, which is impossible. Animal life would never support the strain of his too ambitious program. Death and blood and all the problems arising in connection with them are, then, the central difficulty with us as progressive animals. No one could object to wars for an instant if they were like the Valhalla Wars, in which the dead rose up and rode home to a good dinner once the battle was over. It is the fact that they are supposed, rightly or wrongly, to be real that makes them objectionable. And I have just indicated what lines the solution of that secular problem would take here. A few further remarks of a general nature may define a little more the answer intended. The philosopher at all times is opposed to violence, at least, it is very seldom that he is not, Sorel and Nietzsche being exceptions. The philosophic man inveighs against violence ostensibly on other people's behalf. Really he is speaking for himself. Not only has he no mandate, but he would be found on careful investigation not to have the sanction of life, for his humane contentions. As in the play or novel, drama or violence is a highly prized ingredient, so it is in life, which the majority of people do not take so seriously as the philosopher. The philosopher is apt to regard life, tout court, as precious and full of mysterious power and sanctity, because his own is so full of interest and vitality. That is probably not the general view. Most people cannot develop any such flattering conception of their personal existence. The faith and conviction of the philosopher imposes itself on them when they come in contact with it. But when they get out of touch with this influence, which tends to attach so much importance to everything, they naturally pitch their tone much lower, and a fatalism or frivolity where life and death are concerned is the result. Shakespeare developed that curious and questionable art of building us a refuge from despair by disguising the cruelties of nature as jokes, says Mr. Shaw. If this is a true account of Shakespearean humor, then it was not Shakespeare who invented it. The popular mind is at one with Shakespeare in that respect. And it is actually a characteristic of philosophy that enables it to reach this questionable condition, if Schopenhauer's definition holds, namely, that the true philosopher is to be recognized by a constant sense of the unreality of the things by which he is surrounded. How then is bloodshed or violence to be regarded? Essentially as an excess, nothing more, for if you see life not in compartments, but unified as one appetite, violence is a sadism merely, a degeneration the powerful ruler would ban. The Roman mortuary games, and their eventual overwhelming extension into an official bloodbath, were the sign of the decline of authority and power. No moral or ethical value can stand for a moment against the intoxication of death, and such values are of no service except in secure and peaceful times. Nothing but the most dreadful force can deal with a license of that sort that has got its head. Therefore there are times when any resolute ambitious force must be supported. Where violence is concerned, the aesthetic principle is evidently of more weight than the moral, the latter being only the machinery to regulate the former. One is an expedient, whose pretensions can easily be exploded, the other is the thing itself. As measure is the principle of all true art, and as art is an enemy of all excess, so it is along aesthetic lines that the solution of this problem should be sought rather than along moral, or police, lines, or humanitarian ones. The soberness, measure, and order that reigns in all the greatest productions of art is the thing on which it is most useful to fix the mind in considering this problem. The blood of the Roman circus, the cheap pastry of stuffy and satic romance, with its sweet and viscous sentimentalism, which was manufactured with such success by Proust, the highly spiced incestuous pastry of Freud, the exaggeration, emphasis, and unreality of all forms of common melodrama, are all in the same class, and are vulgar first, and evil because of that. The ethical canon must ultimately take its authority from taste. It is a higher form of the appetite that leads to excess, that leads to the measure of aesthetic delight. Sadistic excess attempts to reach roughly and by harshness what art reaches by fineness.